Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today. I'm your host, Sharlee Dixon. I'm joined by Mallary Tenore Tarpley. Mallary is the author of Slip, Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery. In this deeply personal and powerfully researched debut, Mallary weaves her own story of anorexia and grief, beginning with the loss of her mother, into interviews with experts and survivors to illuminate the often overlooked realities of recovery. Her concept of the middle place offers a compassionate, honest framework for understanding recovery, not as a destination, but as an ongoing journey. In addition to her work as an author, Mallary is a journalism and writing professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and more. We're excited to have Mallary on the show today to explore her book Slip and her reframing of eating disorder recovery as an ongoing, nonlinear journey, one shaped by grief, personal growth, and the often silenced reality of living in the middle place between sickness and full healing. Mallary, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So, as we get started today, what inspired you to write your book, Slip? And how did your personal journey with grief and recovery inform the heart of this book?
So I have always identified as a writer, and I knew from the time I was a little girl that I wanted to write a book. And even when I was in treatment for an eating disorder, I meticulously kept journals. So I would write in my journals every day. And it was almost as if even then, as a 13-year-old, I knew that I would one day want to write about these experiences. And when I was writing Slip, I actually was able to uncover all of these childhood journals. There are about 33 total. And in many ways, they felt like a gift to my present day self because they helped me corroborate memory and re inhabit my younger self. But really, it was my experiences with the messiness of grief and recovery that really made me want to write this book. Because as I looked at other books on eating disorders, I found that most were either written from the perspective of people who were fully recovered, or they were written from the perspective of clinicians. And
Right.
while I found that these books were valuable in different ways, I very often felt like they didn't address the messy middle of recovery, this sort of space in between acute sickness and full recovery. And that was the space that I found myself in and still find myself in. So that lack of a mirrored image left me feeling really alone and misunderstood. And I wanted to be able to write a book that spoke to that middle place and that enabled people who live in that space to really feel seen and heard. And I think that that middle place is certainly apt when we talk about recovery, but it's also something that I've experienced with regard to the loss of my mother. I've never really sort of experienced this sense of closure, even though she died 30 years ago. In many ways, I'm in this middle place with grief where I still carry the load of that loss, but it has lightened over time.
Absolutely. And I want to take a second to say that I'm so sorry for your loss. Losing a parent or anyone that we love is a difficult time. So even if it was 30 years ago, it is still a deep wound, and grief is nothing that moves very quickly. You kind of have to ride the wave. So thank you for sharing that with us. And again, I'm deeply sorry for your loss.
Thank you for that.
Absolutely. You mentioned a couple of times that you described Slip as a book that lives within that middle place between sickness and recovery. Can you explain what that middle place looks like, what it feels like for someone that may be there, and why you name it the middle place? Why is the name so important?
Sure. So, particularly in the eating disorder field, there's a big push for everyone to achieve full recovery. And yet, the field hasn't yet come to a general consensus definition on what full recovery even looks like. So, it does make it hard to compare research, and it makes it really confusing for patients when they can't arrive at that place of full recovery, or when maybe it takes them a really long time to get there. And I've talked with a lot of clinicians about just how challenging it can be for folks to try to reach full recovery if they and the field at large don't really understand what it means. And I think that there's a lot of stigma and shame for people who are navigating this middle place because there's this sense that somehow they're failing at their eating disorder and failing at recovery. And it almost can feel like this limbo. And because this place sometimes gets stigmatized, people stay silent. And I think that a lot of people in this space who I interviewed for the book said that they felt like they couldn't ever share their story, nor did they even have a name for this space they found themselves in. So I think there's a lot of power in being able to name a place that we find ourselves in recovery, and also to be able to have conversations about the messy, imperfect nature of recovery from an eating disorder, because we don't often allow enough space for those conversations. And the language we use to describe illness and recovery tends to be pretty black and white,
Yeah.
right? We're sick or we're recovered, it's curable or it's terminal, right? And there's sort of this semantic expanse in between, if you will. And so
Yeah.
I think there's this widening of vocabulary that needs to happen. And for me, naming the middle place, I think, gives us more language for describing the recovery process, and also just allows us to have a more inclusive approach to thinking about recovery and the various forms in which it can take shape.
Absolutely. And I think you put a great emphasis on that. It is a journey. It's not I decided or I realized I have a problem and I'm fixing the problem. The problem is just fixed and it just works out so easily. And anything I've ever read, which, and I'll be honest, has not even been a ton, especially even being a practitioner, a social worker in the school system. Many of those years were in high school years. I don't think that I read maybe one or two books about eating disorders and how it affects teens, and they were all from the perspective of the clinician, and this is what recovery looks like, but it does not necessarily really even address that middle place that you're discussing, where it's you aren't necessarily healed, but you aren't as sick as you were before. And so addressing that middle piece, I do agree, is something that is missing, especially within the eating disorder arena, and many other forms of recovery, like mental health, other ways of mental health, alcoholism, those types of things. There, that space, that journey is discussed. You really go through what it means to be there, but I have not heard it really discussed in the eating disorder field just yet. So it's important that you're bringing it up for us.
Yeah, thank you for that. I don't think it's really addressed all that often in
Mm-mm.
eating disorders. And we hear more about this sort of space in regard to addiction, I think,
Yeah.
because that verbiage around being in recovery
Yes.
is quite common when we think about Alcoholics Anonymous. But in the eating disorder space, to say that you're in recovery can sometimes feel almost like a bad thing, because it suggests
Mm.
that you're still grappling with the eating disorder. And I tend to put a more positive spin on it. And I think that to be in recovery is to recognize that you are trying to actively move forward and make progress in the middle place. And I think in the middle place, heartbreak and hope can coexist,
Yeah.
slips and progress can coexist. So the more we can normalize that and destigmatize it, the better.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you just mentioned a question that you brought up, a question for me that I wanted to ask. The title of your book is called Slip. What is the significance of that word in this process to recovery?
So I remember that when I was in college, it was a couple years after I had gotten out of residential treatment, and I was petrified of making a mistake or of slipping, because I thought that if I made one wrong move, if I slipped just once, I would quickly slide back into dangerous territory and get sick
Mhm.
again.
Yeah.
And no one ever told me that slips are an inevitable and sort of important part of the recovery process. Now, granted, I was in treatment in the late 90s, early 2000s,
Mhm.
and I think our field has grown since then. But
Yeah.
still, I don't think we talk enough about slips. And even when I was interviewing a clinician about the book, I told her that the title was Slip. And she said, "Oh, I wouldn't title it that, because that word has a really negative connotation in our field." And I
Mhm.
thought, well, that's precisely the point. I said, I
Right.
don't want people to feel ashamed of these slips, because the more we feel ashamed of them, the easier it becomes for these slips to turn into these slides that can lead to relapse. And I think that if we can sort of shift our focus around slips and look at them not as grounds for failure, but as opportunities for growth, then we can begin to make meaningful progress forward. because even if you think about that word slip, it suggests some sort of forward movement because you
It
can't
does.
slip if you're standing
If you're not,
still.
mhm.
And so it feels like a very bold title, but it also just feels like a beautiful one because I've been able to really sort of embrace the fact that slips do happen. And rather than beat myself up over them, I really try to use them as a learning tool and say, okay, what do I need to get back up again? What can I learn from this so that I can keep trying to move forward?
Absolutely. And I completely agree with you that a slip, to me, I think of slipping like I'm going somewhere, I slip a little bit, but I just get up and keep going. It does not mean that I've completely fell off the sidewalk or whatever journey that I'm on. So I appreciate that you were intentional about using that word and kind of flipping what it may have meant in the, in the traditional, stance of treatment around, eating disorders and switch it to something that can be seen as positive. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
that. I hope it helps people.
Absolutely. And so you've mentioned that you have interviewed lots of people, and from my understanding, over 700 people with lived experiences. And then you interviewed another almost 200 clinicians and researchers in preparation for writing your book. What common threads emerged in those conversations and in those surveys? And how did they, affirm and challenge your own experiences?
So, I really wanted to make sure that I wasn't just writing about my own experiences
Hmm.
because, in many ways, I fit the stereotypical mold of someone with an eating disorder in that I am female, I am white, I live in a smaller body, I'm middle to upper class. And so, although my story is really the through line of the book, I really wanted to bring in experiences from other folks who had different eating disorders, who live in different size bodies, people of different backgrounds. And so part of the reporting process for me was talking with a lot of different folks with lived experience, but also clinicians and researchers who could really help me to understand the latest research around eating disorders and the latest treatment developments. And one thing that was fascinating for me was of the 724 people who I surveyed from around the world, 85% said that they could identify with this idea of the middle place. And for me, in some ways, that was just mind blowing because for the longest time, I thought that I was the only one in this space. And I don't think that that came from ignorance so much as just this disbelief that there were other people who inhabited this space because it's not talked about. I don't think that many people in this space feel like they're part of any sort of community. They feel very isolated. And so to sort of be able to see that there are 85% of these folks who could identify with it, and then to follow up with them and interview them about this space was really powerful. And many of them said, I just never had a name for this space, or it just always seemed so ineffable. So I couldn't put words to it. And when I began to sort of tell them about the middle place, they thought, oh, that is really helpful. Like I finally feel like someone sort of understanding and validating what I'm going through. So that was really helpful for me. And I hope will be helpful for those who read the book. Also, in terms of talking with clinicians and researchers, there's just so much fascinating research that has come out about eating disorders, especially since I was in treatment years ago. And so there's a lot more interesting research around the genetics of eating disorders and the neurobiology behind them. And so for me to unpack that was really interesting and it helped me to understand eating disorders on a deeper level. I thought I knew a
Yeah.
lot about them as someone with lived experience, but then
Mhm.
once I began to really talk more with researchers and clinicians, I learned so much more about just how our understanding of these disorders has evolved and also how treatment for these disorders has changed.
Absolutely. Thanks. And so in the book, you describe reframing, and we've discussed it a bit here too. That lens or changing that lens and reframing your experience from the lens of the middle place, giving more grace and room to grow versus that of I've fallen down and I cannot get back up. Can you talk about that shift and how someone may experience that shift in going from I don't know about this place that I'm in, I'm now failing, and how to see that as a positive thing?
Sure. So I think that for me, once I began to think about the middle place, I began to give myself a lot more grace whenever I slipped. And I also was filled with a little bit more possibility and hope, because I think for the longest time, I thought that the end all be all was full recovery. And certainly in the book, I interview people who are fully recovered. So I do think that that can be possible for folks.
Mhm.
But for me, it always felt like this perfectionistic ideal, so that every time I slipped, I felt like I was failing. And rather than thinking about full recovery, I really began to think about just progress in the middle place. And I began to try to aim for more recovery. So, thinking about what is a choice that I can make in service of my recovery that will sort of add to my recovery. And so maybe that more recovery is 1% one day, maybe it's 5% another day.
Mhm.
Maybe it's hard to quantify, but this idea of aiming for more recovery seemed more doable than trying to aim for this full recovery that I didn't quite understand. And so I think if folks can really give themselves grace when they slip, if they can think about making choices that are in service of recovery and more recovery, then maybe over time, that more recovery day by day could lead to a fuller expression of it. So that would be my recommendation. And it's not something that happens overnight. It's sort of a mindset that you have to really develop over time. But I think that it can be helpful. And I think it's important to really be open to just the different ways in which we think about recovery.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor.
Whether you're a longtime or first-time listener to Behavioral Health Today, you're probably familiar with Triad, the company that brings you this podcast. But you may not know that Triad also hosts a community for current and aspiring behavioral and mental health professionals, featuring trending content and education and career resources, all for free. If you are a behavioral or mental health professional, or you're studying to become one, join more than 80,000 people on Triad by claiming your free professional account today. Visit us at hellotriad.com/BHT. That's hellotriad.com/BHT and join the Triad community today.
Absolutely. And it really seems like your relationship with recovery, just in that process, seems more strong than the relationship with the eating disorder. How does somebody, like, how do you get to that place? And what does it look like on a daily basis to maintain that relationship, not necessarily ignoring that you have had an eating disorder, that you do have a relationship with it there, but how do you focus more on the relationship to recovery and positivity instead?
That's such a great question. And for me, I think part of it has to do with seeing the eating disorder not as the solution, but as the problem. Because I think
Mm,
many of us with eating disorders tend to fall back on disordered behaviors because they're a way of coping when we're struggling with trauma or grief or just a stressful period in life. And for the longest time, I would turn to my disordered behaviors whenever I would feel anxious about something or whenever I was grappling with something difficult. Now I really see the eating disorder as being more problematic in the sense that I know if I turn to those behaviors, they're going to lead me to a darker place. They're going to maybe feel like this quick fix, but it's going to just be a band aid that is going to hurt when it rips off and it's not going to
yeah.
help heal any wounds. And so that's been a big part of it for me. I think that also, in terms of thinking about building that relationship with recovery, it has to do with how you see your identity. And so I think that many people with eating disorders feel as though they're defined by their disorders. And many who are struggling tend to isolate themselves. They tend to lose touch with who they are. For instance, when I was acutely sick, I stopped socializing with friends. I stopped reading and writing, which were things I always loved to do. And every one of my thoughts was consumed by the disorder. And I remember distinctly sort of having this shift in views where I used to say I had anorexia. And then I got to a point where I began to say I am anorexic, as though the eating disorder were really integral to my identity.
Mhm.
And part of recovery was learning how to recognize that the eating disorder didn't define me and that there were so many other parts of my identity that were worth celebrating. And so now, as I look at this relationship to recovery, I recognize as a woman in the middle place that if my identity is a pie, so to speak, the eating disorder still does take up a slice, but it's not the whole pie. There's
Yeah.
so many other slices. I'm a mom, I'm a wife, I'm a professor, I'm a friend, I'm a daughter. And so to be able to really focus on those other pieces rather than only gazing at that eating disorder slice of the pie has been really transformative. And I hope that other people who are kind of in this middle place can also think about what are the other things that define me and who am I beyond my eating disorder.
Absolutely. And I agree with you that I could see how it would kind of take over. And again, you become it and not necessarily it just being a small piece or a larger piece, depending on the person, but just a piece of who you are, not necessarily being all of who you are. You mentioned just now, wanted to ask you about this. How has your experience with with an eating disorder, how has it shaped your romantic relationships or even any trauma that you have previously experienced? How does that or how has that shaped your recovery? And being a journalist already by trade, can we talk a bit about how writing has helped you process through all of this trauma?
Sure. So, right around the time when I was developing this idea of the middle place, I also met my partner, who's now my husband. And the timing was fortuitous in that I recognized that I couldn't really keep my behaviors secret anymore because I was now in a relationship. I was spending a lot more time in this
Yeah.
relationship, and I did not want this relationship to be built upon secrecy. I realized that for this relationship to work, I had to be really vulnerable and I had to talk with my partner about what I was going through and the fact that I was still grappling with the imprints of my disorder. Because for so long I had said, oh, I'm all better, even though I was silently struggling. And once I started to talk more about the middle place, I began to be more honest about where I was at in my recovery and I could make progress. And part of that honesty also had to do with being in a relationship, being vulnerable, and I thought that by sharing my story with my partner, he might turn away from me because maybe he would get scared and run off. But in fact, telling him my story and being vulnerable drew him closer to me. And he then began to open up more about his own experiences with grief, having lost his dad when he was 14. And that then helped me to be more vulnerable and share more stories about losing my mom and developing the eating disorder and the fact that I am in ongoing recovery from it. And so I think that when we can be honest, not just with ourselves, but with others who we trust, that can help us to move forward in recovery. And writing can as well. I think writing can be therapeutic, but it's not therapy per se. So I think it's important to recognize that. But I will say that for me, writing is how I understand the world, it's how I make sense of struggles that I have. So I very often, when writing this book, would journal about things because sometimes I just needed to write about something for an audience of one.
Yeah.
Maybe we don't feel like we're ready to share our whole story with the world or even with another person, but being able to put our thoughts and feelings down on the page can really be cathartic in a lot of ways. And then after I would journal, I would then think about how do I want to write this in the book. There were instances where, maybe I felt like I was really angry about something, or I felt like I was going to run the risk of blaming someone in my writing. So if I journaled about that beforehand, I could kind of get those feelings out on the page. And
Mhm.
then I could come to the actual book writing process with a clear sense of what I wanted to say. It also helped that I had many, many years to kind of process the eating disorder. It's not like
Mhm.
I was writing this in the midst of treatment for an eating disorder. I mean, I started writing this when I was, 20 years out of treatment. So that time also helped. But writing for me, I think, has really been one of my greatest coping mechanisms. And writing honestly has really been at the crux of this book because for many years, I would write from the perspective of someone who was fully recovered, and I was too afraid to admit that I was still struggling.
Mm.
And this book really sheds light on just the hardships that I still face and the struggles I still have. And to be able to be truthful and honest about that in my writing has been just really meaningful.
Awesome. Awesome. We discussed this right before we came on, but even as someone that has been a clinician working with teenagers in really different socioeconomic statuses, in different parts of the South. I'm slightly ashamed to admit that I don't know very much about eating disorders, and even what parents or even clinicians or school staff that spend our time with students and teenagers, what it may look like. And honestly, it really came to light. I don't know if you are a Netflix watcher, but I have been watching this new season of Jenny and Georgia. And one of the characters on the show has been purging. She started second season and continues to purge. And she is dealing with some trauma and some grief at the loss of her parents' relationship and, managing through that. And so looking at it through that lens, most of the people around her had no idea what was happening. Neither of her parents were able to see the signs. To people at the school, no one saw the signs and no one was able to recognize what was happening until a friend actually was a witness to it. And so, as someone who has dealt with an eating disorder and still is in recovery from it, starting at a younger age, what can parents and clinicians, what are some things that we can look for to try to assist our children as they're growing up and dealing with trauma and then trying to figure out how to do life?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And I'm really glad you asked it because I do think there are so many misconceptions about eating disorders. And I mean, I write about in the book how medical providers receive 0 to 2 hours of training on eating disorders. And so doctors are really not getting training on eating disorders. And so, because of that, there are a lot of people who just slip under the radar because they don't look the part, so to speak, of someone with an eating disorder. Even when I was seeking treatment in the 90s, my PCP had told me that essentially my weight loss was just a passing phase. And I've talked with folks even today who say, well, I went to the pediatrician or the doctor, but because I'm not severely underweight, they said I don't have an eating disorder. And we know that even people in larger bodies may be restricting and may actually be in a really acute state, but they're not necessarily being given medical treatment, or folks around them may not necessarily realize that they're struggling. In fact, they may be complimented on weight loss, like you look
Right.
really great. And people just don't understand that internally they're struggling. So, one thing I think parents can really do is try to talk with their children about eating disorders. I've been trying to do this more with my own children who are only 7 and 9, but I've been telling them more about just my own story in pretty general terms. But I want
Okay.
them to know that if they ever have concerns about their body or the food that they're putting into their bodies, or if they're ever feeling insecure about how they look, that I want them to come talk to me. And so, even if you as a parent don't know a whole lot about eating disorders, just to be able to even let your kids know, I'm here if you ever feel uncomfortable in your body, or if someone ever makes a comment about how you look and you
Mhm.
start to really just let those thoughts fester, I don't want them to fester. I want you to come talk to me. And I think inviting that conversation can be really helpful and important. And I think too that certainly weight loss can be a sort of warning sign, but also if you find that your child is retreating, maybe they are trying to go to their room during meal times, or they're kind of running out of their house before breakfast, and every morning they seem to be skipping a meal, for instance, you want to kind of pay attention to that and just notice that those could be warning signs, because unfortunately, folks with eating disorders tend to be pretty good at keeping their behaviors secret.
Mhm.
And it can sometimes be hard for parents to detect that until it's a little bit too late. So I think the open conversation, sort of being aware of potential warning signs, and also really trying to get your child help sooner than later if you suspect they have an eating disorder, because the earlier the intervention, the better the prognosis, research shows. So the longer you wait to get treatment, the harder it can be to arrive at a place of recovery. So those are some tips that I would recommend.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing those. Thank you. So you mentioned that your process through treatment was many years ago. And so can we discuss some of the biggest shifts that you may have noticed in how eating disorder care is delivered now versus when you were hospitalized as a preteen?
Sure. So it really has evolved in a lot of ways. And For instance, when I was in treatment, I was hospitalized 5 times, and then I was in residential treatment for a year and a half. It's almost unheard of nowadays to be in residential treatment for that long. A lot of times, the average day is more like 30 days. So I recognize I was fortunate. Also, my public school district and Department of Mental Health covered my stay. So I didn't have the financial burden of that. But nowadays, there's so many more levels of treatment. So when I left residential treatment, I essentially just went right back home after having been away from home for 18 months. Nowadays, when people are in residential treatment, they step down to a lower level of care typically before simply going home. And so now we have more of a stepped care model, which essentially helps to meet people where they're at. So we have inpatient treatment modalities, we have residential treatment, we have kind of partial hospitalization, we have outpatient programs, and there's just sort of more levels of care depending on what people need at any given moment in time. And patients can step up and down that ladder of care depending on their needs. And so that can help with transitions. And I think that stepped care model also recognizes that there is a middle place. It can be very hard, right, to sort of go from intense inpatient treatment directly to home. There's going to be some transitioning that needs to happen there. So being able to kind of provide these different levels of care can really help patients. Also, there's a lot of online options now that certainly weren't available when I was
Yeah.
younger. So
Yeah.
those can be really helpful, particularly for people in midlife who may be struggling with eating disorders, because we
Mhm.
know that people, even in their 40s, 50s, 60s, can struggle with eating disorders, but maybe they feel like they just can't go to treatment because they've got kids or they have a job.
Mhm.
There's lots of treatment modalities now that are online, and they're using evidence based care to really help folks and to try to make treatment more accessible. So I think that that can be really helpful for individuals who need help but can't necessarily step away and go to inpatient treatment.
Awesome, awesome. From my understanding, you explore some of the new and emerging treatment paths in your book, Slipped, including the use of psychedelics, which I've actually had a few different guests on the show to talk about psychedelics here recently. So I'm just curious on what your perspective is on the early research and the potential role in eating disorder recovery.
So I think that this is fascinating terrain. And I think it's important to note that still today, there is no FDA approved drug that's
Mhm.
shown to reliably treat people with anorexia.
Yeah.
And so there's been some really interesting early research into using psychedelics, including psilocybin and ketamine. And I think it shows promise for at least relieving symptoms in people with anorexia.
Mhm.
Most of the research has been on folks with anorexia, but I hope that that will change and that we'll start to do more research on folks with all different types of eating disorders. But in researching my book, I did learn that some eating disorder treatment centers have started using psychedelics to treat patients. But it is hard to know how well these psychedelics work without randomized controls
Right.
trials. There are some researchers at the University of California, San Diego, who recently conducted the first ever clinical trial evaluating psilocybin among adults with anorexia. So that study was pretty highly preliminary, but the results were promising. If I'm remembering correctly, 70% of participants reported feeling a quality of life improvement and a shift in personal identity. And I think about 60% reported a reduction in the importance of physical appearance. So for me, when I look at that data, I think, there could be something there. And I hope that we get more research into what these psychedelics may be able to do for folks with eating disorders, because there's sort of so much emphasis on weight loss drugs now. And yet
Yeah.
there's really no drugs for folks with anorexia. And so maybe there's something to this idea of psychedelics, knowing that we need to kind of move forward in terms of pharmacological treatments. And I think that this research on psychedelics is a step in the right direction.
Mallory, you just mentioned this emergence of weight loss drugs, GLP-1s, and how they have kind of flooded society. They're all over the news, social media. And I'm really just curious what your takes are on it as someone that has had experience, lived experience with eating disorders and being in that middle place. What does someone being in that middle place, how do you experience this emergence of diet culture and the focus on losing weight?
So, yeah, I mean, I think that I don't want to demonize GLP-1s because I do think that they can be helpful for some folks, particularly those who have diabetes. But I do think that they can be very risky for people who are either predisposed to having an eating disorder or people who have had an eating disorder in the past or who are currently struggling, right? But they
Yeah.
may not be revealing that to a medical provider. And as I mentioned earlier, most medical doctors have not received training on eating disorders. And so they're not necessarily screening folks for eating disorders when they're prescribing these GLP-1s. I've talked with some individuals who said that it was quite easy to get access to these drugs, even though they'd had a history of disordered eating or a full-fledged eating disorder. And so I've talked with someone else who had said she was far along in her recovery and she was taking these GLP-1s for her diabetes. But even on a very low dose of the GLP-1, she was losing her appetite and she could feel herself beginning to slip back into the eating disorder. And she was on solid enough ground with her recovery that she was able to say, okay, I can't go down this path. She began to set timers for herself to remind herself to eat because she did not want to fall back into the disorder. But for a lot of people in the middle place, they may be in a much more vulnerable spot, right? If they're not fully recovered and they're tempted to use these drugs, if they're already sort of in this vulnerable place, these drugs could set them back even farther. So I do think that for some folks, they can be helpful. Maybe they combat that food noise, but we hear all this talk about food noise. And honestly, I think for a lot of people, that food noise is actually hunger, right? Like they're not giving their bodies what they need. So they're constantly thinking about food. So I think we really need to look at the nuance of the language that we're using around these drugs. And we also need to ask, why are we taking this? We need medical providers to really be screening more folks for eating disorders when they're prescribing these drugs. And I think that we also need to pay attention to what this is doing societally. I mean, certainly our culture has always been steeped in weight stigma and fat phobia. But I think now that the use of GLP-1s has opened up the floodgates, so to speak, in the sense that now we are seeing just this emergence of skinny talk. And we are just hearing all these conversations about weight loss and how thin is in. And in some ways, it breaks my heart because I do feel like we were making more movement toward body positivity.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think that if we can meet in the middle somewhere, right? Even if we think about body neutrality, thinking about the body as an instrument rather than an ornament, that can be helpful. And so I think we often sort of oscillate between these extremes so often in life. If we can sort of meet somewhere in the middle, I think that can be a good place to be.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I know I put you on the spot, so thank you for sharing that.
Fine.
So for those listeners who might feel stuck in their own middle place or love someone who is, what words of encouragement or advice would you offer them?
So I would say that recovery is possible, and it's always important to just operate with that mindset. And I would say that you should not be afraid to ask for help, even if you've been in treatment years prior, even if you've never been in treatment. It's always important to try to seek help. Maybe that ends up just being from a trusted loved one or friend. Maybe it ends up being from an eating disorder clinician. I will say sometimes when folks ask for help, they may not get it on the first try because maybe they, again, don't look the part of someone with an eating disorder, or maybe they're discriminated against in some way. And so I would say for individuals who have experienced that, don't give up on trying to seek help and treatment if you feel that you need it. And don't underestimate the power of being able to share your story with someone else. I think the more you can share your story and be open about your slips, the greater progress you'll make in the middle place.
Very nice. Thanks. And I would be remiss if I did not say congratulations on the recent release of your book, Slip: Life in the Middle of Eating Disorder Recovery. Where can our listeners learn more about you and your book?
Great. So my book is out now. So you can find it in bookstores or online, wherever you buy books. So I do hope that you'll check it out. Really wanted to be able to help folks with lived experience, but also clinicians and researchers. But also to, even though it's centered on eating disorders, it's also about grief and love and motherhood. The book is being published now when I'm 40, and my mom was 40 when she passed away. So in some ways, it feels like this really meaningful time to put it out into the world. And I write a lot about this on my Substack. I have a weekly Substack where I talk about writing best practices. So that's just Mallary, MALLARY.substack.com. You can find me on Instagram as well.
Mallary, it was so great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
And thank you to our listeners for taking the time to join us. Make sure to follow us on our social media at Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, and more. We are even on YouTube at Behavioral Health Today. And if you like our show, give us 5 stars and leave us a review. That helps our show get discovered and share the valuable insights in each episode. As always, the resources for this episode and an archive of all of our other episodes can be found on our webpage at triadhq.com/BHT. And we look forward to having you back with us next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Triad Behavioral Health Network, all rights reserved.